Talking Heads Nation in your Dog Days of August World Coming to an End edition with the focus on world. It's Heather Hurlburt at the National Security Network.
And Daniel Drezner at Tufts University and foreignpolicy.com.
We were just gossiping before the lights went up about the sort of August is always foreign policy month, which is somewhat counterintuitive because August is when foreign policy elites the world over go on vacation and congratulate themselves on being as sophisticated as the Europeans to go on vacation, but something always happens.
It does seem that way. I mean, this is after all the 20-year anniversary of the Soviet coup, which, or the coup against Gorbachev, which, went down in August. I'm trying to think of other large events that have happened in August that caused everyone to sort of scramble. There was the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008, obviously. I'm trying to think of what other sort of big events have happened in August.
What month was it when Iraq invaded Kuwait?
That was also in August.
That's
very good, very good. So maybe since 1991, we're just old farts, unfortunately.
Right.
But,
well, I have this vivid memory, actually, of I was a very, very young fart in 1991, and I have to say I assumed that everybody in Washington was as overwhelmed as I was by the Soviet coup attempt, and I missed a dentist appointment, and I breathlessly called the dentist office and said, well, obviously I can't come to my dentist appointment because there's a coup in the Soviet Union. Needless to say, the receptionist was not impressed.
I'm just laughing because all right, so two memories that I can share. The first is that I do remember once when the Gulf War broke out. That was my first year in grad school. Of course, I was 13 at the time. But, I was not doing terribly well in econometrics that year. And I remember, I think, actually trying to use the Gulf War as an excuse for why my problem set was late.
I hope not too many of your students are watching this.
Exactly. Well, let me put it this way. I applaud my TA at the time who just utterly spanked me for, that is, the worst excuse ever. So he was right at the time. It was a completely weak thing. The thing I remember from 20 years ago, I remember the Soviet coup, the reason being that I was, if you remember, there was also Hurricane Bob, because we have a hurricane coming within the next 24 to 36 hours. I was with my family on Martha's Vineyard, which was lovely, except Hurricane Bob, swept through the island, and it was really the only part of the U.S. that was profoundly affected. But I mean, power was out for the whole week. It was impossible to get off the island because the ferry schedules were ridiculous. And this, of course, in the days before the internet and anything else, the only news we could get was on a local transistor radio, and of course, the only news they had at that point was of what was going on in Martha's Vineyard. So I had no idea what was going on for the coup. I was going out of my gourd, So that was a real hardship as a foreign policy wonk being stuck on Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, and that's only 20 years ago.
Exactly. Yes.
Whereas now, as you were just saying that you heard about the earthquake via Twitter before you felt it.
That is true.
And I was at the beach.
Quake, yes.
Felt the earthquake, and once I concluded that my son and I were not going to drown in the tsunami, I checked my email, and I had two emails, one from my mom and one from Ireland asking if I was okay. So the global reach.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but I think if there was an earthquake, it would have taken, if it had been offshore, it would have taken some time, you realize, for a tsunami to come. Okay.
No, well, this was the thing. So I carefully, both watched the lifeguards on their walkie-talkies and, continued using the internet and reminded myself of all the stories about how the water pulls way, way, way out to sea, and sort of nervously thought about how far I would have to run carrying the 7-year-old.
I'm sure you could be, that I would like to see, a Parent Olympics. That would
I would
include
not.
That.
I hope never. I feel like there's already too much Parent Olympics just in regular, everyday parenting.
Well, not the sort of competing, but I like the idea of the different kind of competitions, like the 7-year-old carry. How long can you carry a screaming 7-year-old that's going, "Mommy, oh my God, how long can you go before the 7-year-old wriggles free? I mean, we could actually invent a lot of that, and it would not be a Mom Olympics. I think it would be Parent Olympics. I don't mean to be specifically gendered here.
Well, apropos of sort of screaming and things that happen in August, I was actually surprised. What I was expecting / hoping was going to sort of keep all of Washington from going on vacation in August was that there was going to be a frenzy of activity and discussion around what happens at the UN on Palestine in September. And instead, we've kind of gone into this dark cave of denial and vacation, and there's not all that much conversation about that. And of course, instead, everybody's talking, including you and I, about Libya.
Well, that's because Libya, resolution would be a very, very strong word and the incorrect one. But clearly, events on the ground transpired very, very quickly in Libya to the point where what had, the way in which politically this has played out, kind of like Kosovo for me, I find very similar in the sense of, if you recall, during the Kosovo operation, there was nothing but backbiting and criticism and, oh my God, this is a fiasco and it's horrible and why do we think this was going to go over be so quick and why were ground troops ruled out, so on and so forth. And then of course after it was resolved, it was looked back at as a reasonable policy victory. And I'm finding the same thing happening with respect to Libya.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was working in the State Department during Kosovo, and so I remember that vividly. And this is actually a blog post I should have written and that now someone will steal. But there's 3 or 4 sort of key differences that really, in some ways highlight how much the world has changed.
Okay.
Of course, one is, that's just a policy difference. Is in fact, in Kosovo, we got the negotiated solution. Marti Ahtisaari. And the Russians went in and sort of ended it in a way that I think the South Africans and certainly the Africans were really hoping would happen, and maybe more countries at the UN were really hoping in Libya would happen, and frankly didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of really interesting policy difference. Second, the degree of ridiculous partisan vitriol that has continued in this credit-taking phase really outdoes anything we saw after Kosovo with McCain and Lindsey Graham saying, well, yeah, but it should have happened faster and it would have been better with troops on the ground. And people like the Foreign Policy Initiative saying, well, yeah, but this happened in spite of the Obama administration. And it's just the period of Kosovo looks like incredible bipartisan comedy compared to what we have now, which is kind of stunning.
Do you really think hold on? Do you really think it's been that bad? I mean, I grant you the Graham McCain press release had that sort of lovely passive aggressive quality that you really like when people recognize how it's going to play out. And yeah, there was a foreign policy initiative, but I mean, I haven't seen that much. You're in D.C., so maybe you're more attuned to this, but I don't think of this as necessarily that much more partisan, especially compared to what else has transpired over the past year.
No, I wouldn't compare it to what else has transpired over the past year, but I would compare it to what happened, in Kosovo. And I think in part, actually, because there are so many more outlets for people to be partisan than there were even after Kosovo. So it may be, the difference may be more sort of the number of outlets where people who want to be partisan can be. But that I felt like from where I sit professionally, I was under pressure to offer a political viewpoint on events before I could even responsibly just offer a viewpoint on events.
Right.
Nobody knows where Gaddafi is. Nobody knows whether the rebels have actually, taken Tripoli or not. And people already, is this good for Obama or bad for Obama? 10 minutes went by before people wanted to talk about, is this a vindication of leading from behind? And I think, by the way, using the word vindication before you knew where Gaddafi was, before you were sure the fighting was over, I mean, the fighting's still not over,
right,
is a terrible idea, but the media culture is really pushing on you to do it in a way that is different from what we faced after Kosovo.
No, this is true. I might be very well guilty about this because I wrote a post on Monday saying winners, and I said 5 winners and 5 losers from what had happened with Libya, and then over at The Economist, Will Wilkinson labeled me, quote, not hot, unquote, for doing that kind of winners and losers thing. I mean,
But wait, stop, because in the meta way, the very fact that you wrote a post that got Will Wilkinson to label you not hot is by itself hot, right?
Woohoo! Sorry.
No, but that's the
in your
crazy
face, Wilkinson.
Of all of this.
I mean, let me put it this way. I'm sympathetic to the point of, and I think I said winners and losers, and I had an ellipsis, and then I said this week, implying obviously, the circumstances can change. But the fact is that there was a significant enough shift of what was happening on the ground so that I did think, some scene setting or some survey, sort of assessment was actually appropriate.
No, I did a similar thing, which didn't lead Will Wilkinson to notice me at all.
Well,
clearly, because I forgot to have a list.
Yes, I think you're right. I think I had 5 up and 5 down. Who's up, who's down? That was the way in which I think it captured the attention.
Yep.
But also, I mean, in fairness for my list, I'll still back it up because primarily it was about the sort of notion that the military phase of the campaign, in terms of what NATO was doing, was by and large winding down. And I'm reasonably firm in that, or comfortable in making that assessment. So in that sense, I think it was right. But you're right that one of the problems we have now is that, there are instant assessments, instant consensuses, and then, of course, darn those events, they continue to happen.
Well, as long as we're bragging about things we got right on Monday that are still right, I'll brag about mine, and then I'll ask you about one of mine, actually.
Okay.
Which is my, sort of one of the points, knowing that we were going to get into this political maelstrom within seconds, one of the points I thought it was really key to make was those shots on your TVs of people jumping up and down and celebrating in Benghazi. A lot of those people are alive because of the NATO intervention.
Yeah.
That seems like a point that's worth making. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it also seems that there's been a significant, or potentially a significant cost to this in terms of the way that there's a perception in New York among countries at the UN that what NATO has been doing went way past what the mandate was, and that crazily this may be a victory, this may be a great, let's hope it's a great victory for the people of Libya. It may have been a great victory for the principle of responsibility to protect, but may in the end have actually made it harder rather than easier to do this again.
I tend to agree. In fact, I would actually say that this is a serious problem for R2P. Because let's face it, NATO went way past whatever the sort of civilian protection argument that was used to gin this up. And it was also in a situation where I don't recall, you were probably paying attention to what NATO officials were saying more acutely, but, NATO never actually just came out and said, you know what, we think the only way to protect civilians is to get rid of Gaddafi, and that's what we're going to do. I mean, that's what people like Obama said, but it was never necessarily what NATO people said. And so in some ways, there was this kind of, it was a similar sort of, the parallel I would make was with the UN sanctions placed on Iraq after the first Gulf War, where on the one hand, if you took a look at what the sanctions were supposed to be for, it was about dealing with WMD and, repatriation of Kuwaiti assets and a whole variety of very specific things. But the obvious, sotto voce reason for the sanctions was to force regime change. In this case, as it turned out, U.S. and NATO forces, because you had, I think because Gaddafi was simply, commanded less support, and because there was an active rebel movement, was able to overthrow them. But you're right that, within 2 hours of the resolution being passed, you had the president of the Arab League, walking back with support. You had the South Africans walking back their support. Neither the Russians and the Chinese were thrilled about this, and the Germans abstained as well.
Yeah, well, there's two sides to this, I have to say. And one is that I'm a little impatient with the countries that, as you say, were walking back their support almost immediately, as if they seemed to have expected that just the passing of a UN resolution would cause Gaddafi to step down and that force wouldn't actually be used. And I had quoted secondhand to me the remark of a prominent American leftist cultural figure who said, well, I was okay with it for the first 12 hours. And, in my view, if that's how you feel, then you need to have the courage of your convictions and oppose the use of force. Because the use of force has its own logic. It's going to kill people. Yeah. It's going to bring in more force. And you should have a very high standard for what is the occasion that justifies that. Because it's a blunt instrument. You don't use it within 12, and then in 12 hours it's over. And, this is, to Bob Gates' credit, he and the Pentagon were saying to anybody who would listen, look, we're going to be taking out air defense units. Those are going to be located in crowded civilian areas.
Right.
There are going to be casualties. This is not going to be like a video game. Mm-hmm. So I was a little bit impatient. It's of course easy for me, sitting in my office in front of my little webcam to say, oh, I was impatient. But it was interesting to me and frustrating that there was this kind of, it seems, willful naivete on the part of some countries. Now, that's different from what happened later where, as you say, it was very hard for me to understand how bombing the roads to help the rebel advance can be defended, or what's going on today in Sirte, which if you want to get rid of Gaddafi, that's fine. I suppose you could make the argument that they think that they're shooting prisoners insert. But I have not seen a whole lot of effort to keep defining this in humanitarian terms.
Right. No, the fact is, this is not, no, it's no longer a humanitarian mission. It's close air support, which, advances certain goals, but the principle of R2P is not one of them, I guess would be the way to put it. I mean, and I can understand, there is a way in which you can step back and make the argument of, look, the only way if you really truly want to, minimize the loss of life down the road, you're going to need to have a unity of government and so on and so forth, and therefore, just allowing, loyalists to fester will, cause bigger problems. And I think there's an argument to be made for that, but it's not the same argument that R2P is, I guess would be the way to put it.
Yeah, and the other thing that it eclipses if we lapse into our R2P wonkery for a moment is both that so much of what you actually want to do under a responsibility to protect lens is not using your military. It's not close air support. It's that you want to be doing things before you get to this point.
Right. You want to be engaged in prevention rather than cure.
Yeah. And the other thing is, of course, that there was this quite successful little operation in the Ivory Coast, which wouldn't, I think, have happened except that Libya had begun, just a week or two before.
Yep.
Which did, bring in the French to help back up a UN mission, which was unabashedly taking sides,
yeah.
but with a guy who had legitimately won an election against a guy who was refusing to cede power, and which made the difference at a crucial moment and prevented what people believed was going to be a significantly higher level of violence. And that nobody noticed because of Libya, and that in some ways is going to turn out to be the much better precedent, but as I say, nobody noticed it.
Well, isn't this, this gets to another problem, you could argue, not with Libya per se, but just the way in which it ties back in your notion of how these things are covered, which is, Libya is the kind of high-profile military action that tends to suck up a lot of media oxygen. And as a result, when there is what appears to be a resolution or a quasi-resolution, whatever has happened over the past week where the Gaddafi forces have clearly, collapsed in terms of what they can do, there is this period in which, everyone says, oh, okay, what lessons can we draw? Because this was a big, important case, and we should infer lessons from that. Fareed Zakaria did this, and he'll probably do it again on his Sunday show, saying, this is what we've learned. And Ben Rhodes did this interview with Josh Rogan at Foreign Policy Magazine, saying this is, why our approach to intervention is so superior to the regime change policies in Iraq or Afghanistan. As you say, I think there's a danger in looking only at the big cases because sometimes, the amount of sort of luck and or idiosyncrasies that are peculiar to any big case means that trying to generalize from them is very dangerous.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is the bane of every administration, that you're always being pursued. Do you have a system? Do you have a unified theory?
A doctrine.
What's your bumper sticker? What's
your
doctrine?
Strategy,
it has
yes.
to work the same in every case. Well, you bombed Libya. Why didn't you bomb Syria? Well, because the opposition movement in Syria doesn't want to be bombed. Isn't that a good enough answer for you? But there is that our whole system is just empowered to demand answers to that kind of question. Mm-hmm. Instead of saying, well, let's wait and see what happens, and let's wait and see, or, let's spend all of this time that we're fulminating, and rather than have Ben, and I understand why Ben felt like he had to do that. I understand why any administration would feel like it had to do that, but I'd much rather have the forces of the administration putting all of that effort into how are we, and more importantly, how are we going to get the UN, the EU, and the Arab League to give support on the ground that's necessary to win the peace, which is going to be a lot harder. And, but an administration that only focused on that and didn't focus on the public communication and what's the story that people are hearing about this would be committing malpractice.
Yeah, no. There's obviously a political dimension to these sorts of things, particularly if you have what is considered, at least at the moment, a widely perceived military victory. But that said, yes, there was part of me that cringed. And as you point out, there are ways in which this, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, if for no small reason, things like there are losers that come out of this, in particular, most of sub-Saharan Africa, as you said. First, because South Africa looked utterly incompetent during the conflict trying to broker a peace deal. They're now being extremely obstinate about the release of Libyan government assets with the notion that would obviously contribute to the rebuilding. And of course, this highlights the fact that sort of Gaddafi saw himself as a kind of African uniter, and he was, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the people that jump-started the African Union as well. And there are a fair number of African leaders that got a fair amount of money from Gaddafi for a variety
I was going to say Gaddafi was very generous with his country's resources. Although you can't just put it down
outside
to that
of Libya,
because the South Africans played a similarly key but problematic role in the Ivory Coast case. And this is
actually now that you could also they played an even more incompetent role in Zimbabwe too.
Although incompetent is a word you can use, but I think that actually masks the problem, because it's not the case that if it was a different and more competent, quote unquote, foreign ministry or leader, it would somehow be different. It is that South Africa's conception of how things should go on the continent and what their role as a leader should be is very different from not just the U.S. but the broader sort of Western construct. So it's not incompetent. It's very competently slowing down outsiders' ideas of how things should go.
But I guess my question is: doesn't there come a point after which that policy doesn't look terribly good, particularly, let's say, in a situation where with the way Libya is going to play out, because presumably whatever new country, whatever, if the NTC, or is it NTC or TNC?
It seems to depend on who you're talking to be perfectly honest. I've seen it both ways.
I hate to say this. This only makes me think of Monty Python's Life of Brian.
Yeah.
And the Judean People's Front.
Liberation.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, the point is that presumably the NTC government is not going to look too kindly upon South Africa or the rest of the sub-Saharan region as a result of the way they play this out. But what I am intrigued by is whether you think South Africa will continue to play as outsized a role as it does now in the region, or whether there's going to come a point where other countries in the region are going to get sick of this.
Well, I guess the way I would frame the question is: does there and when does there come a point where that any other country in the region has the resources and the moral status that South Africa has, or is there a moment? How long does South Africa's have a moral aspect to its leadership,
because its closest challenger at this point would be Nigeria. And Nigeria is suffering from huge problems right now. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I wish you could point to the day where you thought in 5 years or 10 years the Nigerians will be catching up, because they should play an outside, and they do. In their region, and when it comes to peacekeeping forces, they do play a big role. But so the South Africans just start with resources, both tangible and intangible, that it's hard to see. I suppose an interesting question is: does an Egypt decide to look southward at some point?
This requires an Egyptian government that actually, has some semblance of domestic legitimacy. This is. Wouldn't this depend in part on how it depends in part on how the transition goes in Egypt? I would presume.
Yeah, no, that's you're 5 years off at best from that as well, I suppose.
And then, of course, there's this question about I don't know if you saw this. I think it was Thomas Barnett had something in Time where he crudely drew Africa between the sort of animist South and the Muslim North, saying that was the fundamental cleavage for Africa, which I think is a touch simplistic.
Ho hum.
Yeah, exactly. This, but if nothing else, this will require, suggesting therefore that AFRICOM is going to have to pay greater attention because of instability. But no, I'm with you. I don't think this is necessarily going to lead to greater.
Do you think it's useful if you primarily analyze Europe between the Catholic South and the Protestant North? What does that buy you?
It would have led you to predict which countries were going to, be in deep trouble because no, actually, you would have led to the no. It would have led you to which countries were going to be in really big economic trouble. So it's because it's all the southern Mediterranean ones.
Plus Ireland.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, they're Catholic too.
Yeah, the Czechs are divided religiously. The Germans are divided anyway.
Yeah, no. It's a bad. I'm sorry, we can't go with that. All right, so going forward to Libya, I guess one of the let's face it, we in the United States, as we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, are, understandably cautious, as you said, about the appearance of military victory then turning, to ashes as the sort of post-conflict reconstruction begins. And I don't think anyone, over the past week who has thought of this as a policy victory, everyone has said, with the caveat of course we need to, assuming everything goes well going forward. I guess my question is, do you think everything will go well going forward?
Well, the first thing I actually want to say is I think people should really calm down about the military victory stuff, and both because, it was closed air support, not a military campaign. And second, that the Libyans are feeling very pleased with themselves for what they did themselves, and it's in everybody's interest that be the story. I mean, it's not useful. If we haven't learned yet that it's not, sorry to lapse into my own lesson learning mode, but if we haven't learned yet that it's neither useful domestically nor internationally to thump your chest and say, we took out the government of country X, for God's sake, learn it now. And look, I mean, I can run through the same factors that everybody else is running through, that, it's the advantages the Libyans seem to have are, that they're ready to accept help, that there's, in some ways, although it's a tribal society, it doesn't have sort of some of the stark cleavages that other societies that we've been embroiled in lately have. They do have the ability to turn on and hopefully get oil resources flowing again fairly quickly. They do have the money that's being held for them, and the TNC is both an asset and a liability, in that you've got heading it some very interesting and sophisticated characters, both people who were in the government for a long time and people who were in opposition and were human rights lawyers for a long time, and have worked the outside world very well up to now. So those are all, frankly, big points in their favor. I mean, big negatives, obviously the natural resources can be a curse as well as a blessing. You don't have much of a tradition of political parties, democratic institutions, popular participation, any of the things that people are very talking very glibly about quickly setting up, and you have, some big simmering resentments and a whole lot of people running around with guns.
And don't forget the Gaddafis are still, the
Gaddafis are still on the loose. So I feel modestly optimistic about it, because there do seem, there's such a large number of reasons and resources for it to go well, and that I think some big early bad decisions are not being made, trying to keep the security forces intact and use them to control the streets, thinking through right now how to get back guns and things that are getting out of control, moving quickly to provide petroleum resources, try to get the economy going again. So if for no other reason, look, you can make whatever set of assertions you wanted. I also note that people had pretty much given up on the idea that the rebels were going to be able to force a military end to this, and then lo and behold, helped by people in Tripoli who were ready to see Gaddafi gone. They did. So I actually, Friday afternoon, I come down on the side of optimism, but I freely admit that that's not because of my decades of deep engagement with Libyan society. Which
is a fair point. No, I don't necessarily disagree with anything you just said, actually. It's the sort of conventional, that would be my take as well. In some ways, the striking thing to me is just, it's almost comparing, just how crazy were dictators, or how, good were they at resource accumulation. So, the comparison to Iraq, in some ways, Libya is just a smaller problem, and a country that actually has, significantly more assets that they can plow back into reconstruction and redevelopment. So, you have to think those are promising. And also, as you said, I think without question, the biggest difference is that you had, what was an indigenous uprising of people that genuinely wanted Gaddafi gone. And so, if nothing else, even if things, go a little sour, you have to think at least the initial conditions are somewhat promising. Also, this guy, is it Jibril, I think is his name, the head of the NTC? He actually scares me, because every time I hear something he says, it sounds really, really smart, which, makes me worried that he's just talking to me and not actually talking to Libyans. But he does seem to be saying all the right things, so we'll see how that proceeds going forward.
There's one other really key point that I think we have to keep making over and over again for American audiences in particular, and that's a time frame one. Mm-hmm. In all of the Arab Spring countries, there's a tendency to sort of define success as, do they have elections within 3 months and a democracy that looks like the U.S. or Europe or Switzerland within 6 months? And you can take a very glass half empty view of the Arab Spring, and a lot of people do. You can also say, hey, wait a minute. Mubarak is sitting in a cage in a civilian court being made to answer for the gunning down of civilians. If you had said to an Egyptian a year ago that would be happening now, they would have laughed at you. It's amazing the transformation that has taken place in that country, partial, incomplete, and problematic though it is. The other thing that I think it's useful to remember is that, when Bulgaria had its first free election after the fall of the Warsaw Pact, they voted in the communists in Bulgaria. And it took a number of years to settle into the perfectly reasonable governance that Bulgaria has now. Some other Central European countries went back and forth in ways that were a little bit disconcerting and took very different paths. So I think, again, to go back to criticizing the way we talk about these things and how we love to be talking heads here at home, if you take a 5, 10, 15-year lens, there's every reason for optimism, actually. If you take a 6-month lens, there's almost no reason for optimism.
Right. Although I have to say, it's interesting. I mean, you were talking about Arab Spring countries. This might be where the policy disasters of the last decade actually, where I see the glass half full, because my comparison is not necessarily to Egypt or Tunisia. My comparison is to Iraq in 2003. So I'm thinking, hey, there's no looting. This is a good sign. So in the sense of, if so long as there's no insurgency 6 months from now, I'll be in a pretty chipper mood with respect to Libya, which of course...
I do think it's a very interesting and dismaying thought experiment to imagine what it would have been like if there had been a popular uprising that had removed Saddam instead of the way Saddam was removed, and to imagine how different things might have been. And because to the extent to which we, while not wittingly, not intentionally, but that we did create some of the conditions that allowed the looting and some of the other terrible things that happened to happen.
Hey, stuff happens. No, I mean, to be fair, though, there was that. It just didn't happen in 2003. It happened in 1991 after the first Gulf War.
Right.
And for a variety of reasons, which you can talk about, the first Bush administration basically allowed Saddam to, use air power to subdue, both the Shia and the Kurds to a lesser extent. So, it's one of those, what would have happened had history been different kind of questions.
Yeah. I have a good friend who does counterfactual, and I could never keep more than about 1.5 counterfactuals straight in my own mind, I have to say.
Well, the other problem is that the further you go in time, the more ridiculous the counterfact, the wider possibility of options that you could have very often with the counterfactuals. This does remind me, by the way, I don't know if you've kept up on this. I see that Dick Cheney's memoirs are out.
Yes. And Dick Cheney, speaking of counterfactuals, thinks it would have been better if we had gone ahead and bombed Syria instead of letting the Israelis do it.
I have to say, I think that truly the most bizarre part of this, I haven't read any of the memoirs yet, but I did read, I think it was the New York Times account of it, in which Cheney admitted to having an almost Tony Soprano-like state of unconsciousness in 2010. Did you read about this?
Yeah.
Where he apparently dreamt he was in an Italian villa trying to order or trying to go shopping or something along those lines. But anyway, needless to say, it sounds like Cheney's memoirs are on par, I think, with Don Rumsfeld's memoirs in sort of bulldozing ahead. This was my opinion about how things worked, and if only Condi Rice or Colin Powell had been of stronger spine, the Bush administration would be much more glorious than it actually was.
Well, that's his story, and he's sticking to it.
Do you? I'm curious. We know that Condi Rice's memoirs are coming out eventually as well. I mean, do you think we'll eventually get a sort of clear-eyed picture of what happened during those years because there was so much, so many disputes among the foreign policy principles?
Well, you're the academic, so I feel like I should be asking you that question. I think
I'm glad you asked me that question, Heather. No.
If we, I mean, I think I just was reading a blurb about Rice's memoir, actually, which was promising both that it would be, basically promising both that it would be score settling and that it would showcase her essential warmth and humanity. And
that
also
is,
that
to
it
be
would
fair,
tell us how she had kept...
to be fair, this is exactly why Muammar Gaddafi kept a... did you hear about this photo stash of Condi?
Yeah, and I have to say, I wasn't going to go there because,
it's
that's
just
not
icky.
her fault.
Yes. No, it's totally not her fault. No. But but your point is that you don't think.
But here's the thing.
Yep.
If and sorry to do this, but if they barged in there and they found a photo stash of Don Rumsfeld, the implication would have been, he was using them for target practice. And there's a photo stash of Condi, and there's a different implication, and that's just sort of tedious.
No,
even though I'm sure it's also correct given what we know about Gaddafi's predilections for very powerful appearing women surrounding him at all times. But I do feel like it's it's not something I wish on Condi Rice, even though I don't have particularly warm feelings toward her as a member of the policy elite.
Well, I took classes with Condi at Stanford, so I have warmer feelings towards her, and like you, I don't wish this. You don't wish this on any policymaker because it's just.
And as I say, I'm waiting for the day that somebody says they found a stash of photos of Don Rumsfeld in some, or Dick Cheney for that matter, since his book is out, in some dictator's bunker somewhere.
Heather, I just threw up in my mouth a little bit. Okay, I'm recovered now. In terms of, you were asking me before about whether or not Condi can do, how she'll do in terms of her memoirs. I would predict this: they will probably be. I actually do think she can thread the needle you were talking about before. The only reason I say this is based on the last memoir she wrote. Or not so much the last memoir, but her book with Phil Zelikow on German reunification, which is pretty widely acknowledged to be one of the better books about the reunification of Germany. And she did a top-notch job on that. So I suspect that... these memoirs will actually be, pretty good in terms of presenting her side of the story.
Okay, well, note it down for November that there will be a book review blogging heads.
Okay, that sounds great.
At which time I will tell my story about meeting her in an airport in 1990, which I will not tell now. I will save.
Oh, good. We'll swap Condi stories. This will be fun. I like that. But with that, I think. I will wish you best of luck in terms of dealing with Hurricane Irene. What is the, what is the, I read a hysterical tweet today saying that D.C. was treating Irene, as seriously as a snowstorm, which meant very seriously. And, of course, Mayor Michael Bloomberg in New York was treating it as seriously as trans fats, which meant very seriously. So.
I confess to a certain amount of blasé-ness about this. I will go home and check out my batteries and water supply, and the thing I'm most focused on is whether the birthday party my son's supposed to go to on Saturday is canceled or not. I just feel like we've kind of gone, and look, we don't live near the ocean. We are not going to be flooded. There's not going to be a tsunami, and I sort of now feel like we've gone a little bit to the other extreme in terms of the level of angst that we take about these things when you're not. I think, obviously, if I were at the shore, if Martin O'Malley had told me to evacuate, I would be treating this differently. But, I take reasonable precautions, and then I focus on other stuff. So, who knows? When I'm without power for a week, I may regret this.
I was going to say, I think I'm on the other side now. I used to be like you. Part of this was literally a blogging experience I had, which was when Katrina hit New Orleans. I wrote a post talking about hurricane porn. About the sort of news coverage of, oh my God, it's coming, and just the overwhelming amount of it. And, I was like, give me a break, really. How bad is this going to get? And, of course, as it turned out, it got extremely bad.
Right. But not because of the hurricane, because of our terrible disaster response systems, I have to say.
That could be, although it was a Category 5 hurricane. It was a pretty serious hurricane.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing is that in some ways this is your classic local news story, and in some ways it's a no-win situation because the problem is that you do actually want to hype these threats because, God forbid, you do want to prepare for the worst-case scenario. So then one of two things happens. Either the worst case scenario happens, in which case, hopefully people have been prepared, or what is far more likely is that the worst case scenario doesn't happen, but then you get more and more blasé, as you say, with each passing non-worst case scenario happening. Until, of course, the worst case scenario happens again, and then people were caught totally unawares.
Right. Well, that's a great policy dilemma that, I hear from my husband in public health all the time about how do you warn people off of X or Y or Z without eventually producing this overreaction, which is what can't possibly kill me that horribly. And, in some ways we have that in our field as well, that I sometimes, look at global warming. I feel like there's, you do get to where people make extreme claims. I'm not saying this happens with global warming, but it happens with a lot of issues just to get people to pay attention. Mm-hmm. And you can't actually have a reasonable policy discussion anymore. But on that note, Dan, I will look forward to talking to you again after the hurricane.
Okay.
And everybody can watch this Blogging Heads to occupy themselves until the power goes out. Exactly.
Please amuse yourselves right until the power goes out. And I'm sure Heather, hopefully it'll cut out right after you say the really brilliant thing.
Right, Dan. Take care.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.